This episode is brought to you by America's Christian Credit Union, where your money grows and your values thrive.
I think, at least in my experience, especially those who are um, very reasoned, very rational, very intellectual, is that it is a process over time of, in some ways, becoming dissatisfied intellectually where you are, that it's not providing the answers or the clarity or the veracity that it claims, so that it opens the door and motivates you to look, like you say, outside of your own motivated reasoning or confirmation bias to see, okay, maybe it's time actually to see what else is out there. So how did you move from that place of frustration forward?
God ambushed me, I suppose. I
Okay.
I was I was not looking consciously. I was still doing some journalism as I continue to do, kind of on the side of my work as a history professor. So this is about 3 years ago now. I was working on a magazine article about a local Southern Baptist megachurch and its pastor. This is the Summit Church, pastored by J.D. Greear. And he had, at that time, recently stepped down from a tumultuous tenure as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So I was planning to write a story about, why is it that this megachurch is growing, and also kind of putting this in the context of the Southern Baptist Convention and all the turmoil and the challenges of the culture war for evangelistic churches trying to reach a fairly secular, left-leaning part of North Carolina. What we call the triangle, the research triangle. I was early in my research on this church. It took a while to get on JD's calendar for an interview. So I was interviewing other staff and just trying to learn as much about it as I could. And I was really struck by the single-minded focus on evangelism among these Christians. And this is not to say that I had any doubt that other Christians I met in other contexts really believed, Christianity, but there was a relentlessness about Summit staff that a joyful relentlessness, like not a relentlessness that put me off, but just a single-minded energy for getting as many people as possible to hear this message that made me think, man, these people really believe this. Like this is serious. And I guess it just got me to sort of sit up and take notice a little bit. And so I had this conversation with the head pastor coming up, and, I wanted to make the most of it. I had put together all of these notes and had all these topics I wanted to cover. And the conversation, in many ways was a normal interview in which we did cover all of these various sort of culture war type topics and questions about theology and so forth. But I did find myself departing from my own script a little bit. I outed myself as an agnostic, which I don't normally do. I also remember one point in the conversation, and this was not a question that was on my prepared list, where I said, is there any room in your church for people who doubt? A question motivated, I think, by that relentlessness that I had perceived in the culture of this church, which I thought had to stem from a certainty. How can there be any room for doubt if this is your posture toward the world? And he said, well, sure, there's room for doubt. I mean, start with the pastor. And he talked to me about his own, how he thinks about doubt and his own wrestlings with it at various points in his life. And so, it was a great conversation. I didn't really, I didn't have any kind of epiphany or think it would go anywhere that my, interviewing work normally doesn't go after that point. But after we parted ways, he followed up by email, and we ended up having an extended email exchange in which, it started with me, I guess, putting forth in a not particularly thoughtful way, like very basic questions about the claims of Christianity. And, well, why are your claims about the resurrection any more plausible than Mormon claims about Joseph Smith's revelation, or things that Muslims believe about Muhammad? And he would write back these extended, very thoughtful, very scholarly replies with citations. Often he would say, that's a really good question. Let me talk to a few colleagues at the seminary and look up some things and get back to you. And then he would send a few days later, a couple 1,000-word response, much meatier than I was prepared for. And I was surprised and flattered that this like very busy, fancy pastor was taking my questions so seriously. And it compelled me to feel, okay, I have to step up here. I need to take this process seriously. And also I was becoming intrigued. And I was realizing, to my shame, that here I am, a supposed expert on the history of Christianity, but I've never actually looked into the fundamental historical claims of Christianity. And maybe I ought to. So, at a certain point, after a few rounds of email, I said, I'm an academic. Can you just give me some homework and, give me a reading list? And he was very astute, kind of appealing to my ego. And he told me that he had consulted the famous minister, Tim Keller, about my case. And I knew who Tim Keller was. And I was like, man, okay, this is getting serious. I'm being like tag teamed now. And so he said, well, Tim and I have, I talked to him about a book list. Here's a list of books. And it included some of Keller's books and N.T. Wright's Giant, Resurrection and the Son of God, Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. So I began a summer of, it felt like doing a kind of informal but still very intense master's degree in New Testament studies, reading, but also, remember, I was not even a theist at this point. So I had to be working on that level also. And as I was doing a lot of reading in cosmology, books like Francis Collins' Language of God, some of David Bentley Hart's work. And I remember opening a Word document and just beginning to keep a journal, which is not something that I make a habit of, but I just needed a forum in which to record how much I was learning and how I was kind of in a halting way beginning to realize that I had never really interrogated my own assumptions, and that there was this wealth of really excellent biblical scholarship, much of it published since the 1990s. There's really been a renaissance in New Testament scholarship produced by, I would say, believing scholars, but across quite a range of theological perspectives. And J.D. was also very clever in anticipating my kind of, as much as I don't like to think about myself in this way, like he understood at some level I was this Ivy League snob. And so he was recommending books written by, very respectable British Anglican
yes, of course,
professors,
of course.
At Oxford and
yes.
so forth. I had to sort of sit up and take notice. And so that, he was very tactical. And I think this is one of the many, I've thought a lot about how did he execute this like judo move of, here I come in as the journalist, to learn about him, and I'm supposed to be in control. And he turns my own inquisitive powers against myself in some sense. So it was this atmosphere of just really open inquiry. And it's important to stress too that we were becoming friends in kind of unexpectedly, right? Like, I'm a history professor at a secular research university from an agnostic background, and he's like a typical, very pushy, single-minded Baptist pastor from a pretty fundamentalist background, although he's not fundamentalist now. You wouldn't think we would become friends, but it turned out that we had a very common sense of humor. I think that's been important, and from the beginning, we could kind of make fun of one another and also just make fun of the whole situation. Evangelism is awkward. It's like inherently awkward. And I think it's important to be able to joke about it and for the evangelist to make, the seeker feel, well, on the one hand, let's be clear about what's going on here. Like, yeah, I want you to come to Jesus, but I value you as a friend. I'm not sort of seeing you as like a target, to fill my quota. Right. So I think that dynamic was really crucial. So I was working through these books meeting with JD once a month or something, emailing a lot. To my shock, given my high church snob tendencies, I was continuing to go to Summit for worship. I mean, well past the point where my article was done and all of that. I was also re-engaging with scripture. I was reading the Gospels and finding myself affected by them in a way that had never happened to me before. And it started really with the Gospel of Mark, which I think I'd always been the most dismissive of Mark. It's the shortest. Isn't the Greek? Not that I read Greek, but one hears that the Greek is very sort of unpolished, right? There's just not like all of the elaborate theological stuff that you find in John and so forth. But when I came to it in my new frame of mind, I was struck immediately by the grittiness of Mark's gospel. And to some extent, this is true of all the gospel accounts, but especially in Mark, there's just this sense that the author is desperately trying to get down on paper this crazy stuff that happened that he doesn't entirely understand. And it took on the character for me, especially alongside this reading I was doing, of a really interesting primary historical source, which is just not a way I'd ever looked at scripture before. Now, I could not, of course, approach the biblical documents assuming inerrancy or anything close to it, right? I mean, on what grounds could I assume that? But my instinct was to simply accord to the scriptural documents the same respect and benefit of the doubt that I would give to any historical primary source document in any context, right? So this is not to say, you approach them in some state of naivete, but you also don't approach them in with some kind of like postmodern hermeneutic of suspicion, like on a mission to deconstruct every sentence and assume, until proven otherwise, that it's in some way fabricated, right? You're sort of reading it in a straightforward way, which I think is the approach that people in classics, as opposed to in New Testament studies, would be inclined to take toward documents from this period. I was also, trying to go about this in a rigorous way and reading a lot of scholarship produced by non-believing scholars, but I was, continuing to read scripture and finding myself struck especially by the accounts of Jesus's healing and the very precise and kind of personalized ways in which he meets every person. In Mark 7, when Jesus heals the deaf man, he takes him aside privately and puts his fingers into his ears and, after spitting, touches his tongue and says, "Be opened." Or, Mark 8, the blind man at Bethsaida, where Jesus leads him out of the village and spits on his eyes and lays hands on him and, says, "Do you see anything?" And the man says, "Well, I see people, but they look like trees walking." So Jesus has another go at it, and then he's completely healed. I was struck by the weirdness of Jesus's methods that kind of lent these accounts a believability for me. They didn't seem to follow any formula. And as much as I remain kind of resistant to the evangelical tendency to see yourself in scripture constantly. Like, I think that's always part of it, but maybe evangelicals make too much of a point of that. I couldn't help but see myself a bit in this very precise way in which God had sort of set me up with this evangelist who it seemed like God just gave him my file. It was like, here is how to deal with this girl. And that God had set things up for me to be humbled in this very specific way. I was this high church snob who had probably written some slightly snarky things about megachurch seeker-sensitive worship. And here I was kind of caught in the gravitational pull of this, megachurch mothership, right? I wasn't even worshiping at one of the satellite campuses that are smaller. Like I was going to the mothership, really sort of relishing the anonymity of the dark rock concert feel. And like when I could work my nerve up, I could go down and talk to the pastor, but otherwise I could jet out. And yes, they would greet me in their very cheerful way. Summit has a lot of greeters. You get greeted like 6 times by the time you get to the sanctuary, but they leave you alone. They don't like drag you anywhere. But there's something about the very stripped down character of contemporary megachurch worship. And Summit is a very like reformed, theologically serious place where the preaching is a pretty intense experience. And that helped me focus on Jesus for the first time.